This afternoon, we are going to look at an exam question from the OCR English Literature paper from June 2016. This paper is the Prose from Different Cultures paper, and the question is on Of Mice and Men. Now, what we're going to do is look at how does Steinbeck's writing make this such a moving and revealing moment in the novel. And really importantly, we are going to focus on the AO2 and AO4 assessment objectives, because that is what OCR is specifically looking for in these Prose from Different Cultures papers. Now, we don't have time to go into all of the points we want to make, so I'm going to focus on the three most important points that I think feature in this passage. And that is, firstly, the relationship between Lenny and George. Secondly, I want to look at the dream itself. And thirdly, I want to look at the contrast between the dream and their reality. So I think these 3 points are really important because we can look at Steinbeck's language and focus on that to get those AO2 points, but we can also tie in the wider contextual issues from social, historical, and cultural contexts to get those AO4 points as well. And by tying the two AO1, AO2 and AO4 assessment objectives together, you'll be able to really hit those top marks and get into the top bands that you're looking for. So obviously, before you start your question, it's really important to put the passage into context. So explain that this passage comes from the first section of the novel. It's before George and Lenny get to the ranch, which is where most of the drama happens. And also give a summary of what happens in this passage. So George is explaining to Lenny their dream. It's clear they've talked about this dream before, but it's the first time we've heard of it. And it's the first time we have seen any conversation between the two of them. So, looking at the relationship between Lenny and George, I'm just going to change the colour. Has that changed it? Yeah. So, looking at the relationship between Lenny and George, it's really clear here that Steinbeck is setting us up to show George's compassion and Lenny's innocence. This whole passage explains to us the loco parentis position that George is in, and we really get an insight. It's quite a moving and revealing moment, an insight into their relationship and how the two of them work together. Can I zoom in here? So, if we go through the passage, we can see this. As George speaks to Lenny, his voice becomes deeper. He repeats the words rhythmically, like he said them many times before. Now, already we can see that that is a way that a parent may speak to a child. That's not really the way that you'd think two adult men would interact. So you can discuss this language and talk about how Steinbeck's, from the get-go, showing the relationship between the two of them and portraying George in this position of responsibility. They talk about their dream, they talk about the normal men around, which you can then refer to the AO4 points and look at the context of this. We can see that George and Lenny are different to normal men. Not only does George explain this, but from what you know about itinerant workers, you can really draw on the differences between George and Lenny and normal men that we have learnt about, who are living this life usually. Now, Lenny was delighted when George tells his story. He breaks in. He shouts somewhere. He shouts here. And he also, really importantly, uses quite a lot of repetition in his own language. So he says, tell us about the garden you're going to have, and about the rabbits in the cages, and about the rain, and the stove. So through this language, we can see that Steinbeck's drawing a really vivid image of a child speaking. Lenny is clearly not your average grown man, and that's really important contextually for the rest of the novel and in Steinbeck's writing. So that's this one. The next bit we're going to focus on is the dream itself. So, yellow. So, we can see here that George talks about them having a farm. He talks about how they're going to have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, which is a really lovely image. Not only does Steinbeck create quite an idyllic image, But this is also a parallel between the social and historical view of the American dream. Sort of Americans at the time, where we know this was set at the time of the Great Depression, and we know that Americans had been sold this idea that the American dream was something every single American could achieve. They could all own their own house, buy their own plot of land, and live happily. And George really builds on this. Now, this is a really revealing moment, not only because we can see George and Lenny's aim, what they want to achieve together, but it's also the first time we see mention of the American dream, which then does later come up in the novel when we see Curly's wife talking about it in her dream to become a film star. So it's really poignant, and Steinbeck's really emphasising to the reader the importance of the ordinary person having something to look for. Their lives are pretty bleak, but in this passage he creates an idea that it can be more. They'll have a big vegetable patch and a rabbit hutch and chickens. The way that George tells it is like a story. It's this really beautiful image of something they can have, and they'll just say the hell with going to work, and we'll build a fire up in the stove and sit around it and listen to the rain coming down on the roof. Nuts. This imagery here is so poignant and creates such a vivid picture that we really get a feeling for who Lenny and George are and what they want. Now, finally, we are going to look at the contrast between their dream and reality. So all through this, we can see a lovely picture of the two of them, what they want. But actually, at the end of this passage, Steinbeck really brings us back down to earth. George drove his knife through the top of the bean cans. He sawed out the top and passed one can to Lenny. Now, we know that the life of the itinerant worker is bleak. From our studies before, we understand that they're living in the Great Depression, they're living in the Dust Bowl, and it is really bleak. But Steinbeck really shows us this through the contrast of the vivid, beautiful language of their dream and the harsh reality of George driving his knife through the can of the beans. And if you can really zone in on this, you'll get into those top marks if you can explain to the examiner how Steinbeck uses his language to bring us back down to a bump. He sort of sets us up really nicely for most of the passage, and then at the end undercuts it all with this harsh, almost violent image of how they make their dinner and how they prepare it. And this is really important historically because we see the American dream just here. We see what people want, what they think they can do with their lives, and then the whole thing is undercut by the reality of a situation. And that is echoed all throughout the book. All throughout the novel, you see an echo of this, where all of the characters have this dream of more, but the reality is they just can't achieve it. And if you can focus on that language and how it reflects the wider situation, you'll be able to get those top marks and really impress the examiner.